Hey, Sam, does anything feel different today?
Hey, Logan. Different. Well, normally we talk about Faribault stories, and today we're doing a Northfield-centric story. That's different.
No, I think there's something else.
Oh, you know what? We have music from a guest composer, Sam Ryden. That's different.
Maybe not. Well, I was thinking it more like the fact that we're animated.
Oh, yeah. That too. I'm Sam Temple.
I'm Logan Ledman. In this episode of 1855, we'll dissect the fascinating life and dreams of Northfield's founder, John Wesley North. John North was born on January 4th, 1815 in Sand Lake, New York, and by the time of his death, he would help lay the foundations for 4 towns, 3 colleges, 2 states, and a railroad.
His first exposure to the winds of change that shaped 19th century America came as part of the Second Great Awakening. Temperance, women's suffrage, abolition of slavery, all were inextricably linked to the awakening's religious calls for a better society. After experiencing religion at a revival, John North joined the Methodist Church at age 13. North entered Connecticut's Wesleyan University in 1838. There, he gained a reputation as a fierce advocate of the abolitionist movement. Wesleyan was a Methodist college, and the Methodist Church's official stance of slavery was not pro-abolition. North's attempts to persuade college leaders to break from the church's stance led to clashes between him and the administration. By the time he graduated, though, it meant he had made a name for himself in the area.
Out of college, John North signed on to lecture for the Connecticut Anti-Slavery Society. With several years of training and public speaking under his belt and some professional legal tutelage, he opened up a law practice in 1845.
In 1845, John North married Emma Bacon, but in 1846 she died.
North, now back in New York, became horribly sick.
He needed something.
He needed a doctor.
He needed a wife.
He found both in George Loomis.
By day, George S. Loomis was a humble country doctor. By night, he used supposed visits to patients to cover up 20 years as a vital link in the Underground Railroad, helping fugitive slaves escape to Canada.
In 1848, John North was just a sick man under George Loomis's care. As George left to tend to his patients, he entrusted John's health to his daughter, Anne.
Anne Hendricks Loomis was book-smart, educated, and musical. A talented vocalist and pianist, she charmed the sick John as she nursed him back to health. Likewise, John's firmly held beliefs and industriousness must have grown on Anne. The 17-year-old Anne married 33-year-old John in Syracuse.
Syracuse, New York.
Okay.
Okay, yeah, about
Syracuse,
there?
sure.
All right.
Yeah. On August 28th, 1848.
The young couple was not fated to stay in New York, however, for a couple reasons. First, John North wasn't an overly successful lawyer. As North biographer Merlin Stonehouse put it, quote, "He was too impatient of the past to linger over proceedings and too active in the present to accept the routine and confinement of office chores." North had to seek out a new arena for financial security.
Secondly, Anne and her family, perhaps tired of giving medical attention to the frequently ill John, suggested that the open, clear airs out west might improve his health.
In November of 1849, John and Anne moved to a small village called St. Anthony in Minnesota Territory. St. Anthony, Minnesota.
That's Minnesota.
About there?
Sure.
Okay.
Okay. Okay.
There.
That might not be the road he actually took.
Something like that.
Yeah.
St. Anthony would eventually become part of Minneapolis, and at that time, its proximity to the growing Twin Cities made it a lucrative spot for the young couple to settle.
North was a nobody in the state when he arrived. Surrounded by the works of Minnesota's most powerful men, his cabin was provided by Franklin Steele, one of the richest men in Minnesota history. Preeminent fur trader and treaty negotiator Henry Sibley, who would later become Minnesota's first governor, lived nearby. And North would come to know and clash with both men over his time in Minnesota.
In the meantime, North had moderate success as one of only 2 lawyers in St. Anthony. But in the young territory's spirit of growth, a dream sparked in North that molded his rise in Minnesota and the shape of his life. The dream of a utopian community committed to the radical causes of his time.
John North believed St. Anthony could be that community. The problem? Most of the powerful people in the Twin Cities area, especially those connected to the fur trade, were Democrats, sympathetic to the Democratic Party's platform of territorial expansion. The Democratic Party's support for slavery, however, meant John North dedicated himself to finding a way to oppose their power. It was clear that eventually the Minnesota Territory would become a state, and to John North it may have looked clear that it would join the Union under the influence of pro-slavery forces. He needed to try to push against them. He realized how to make it happen and quickly got to work.
John North had connections to abolitionist newspapers throughout the East Coast, stretching from his days as a student at Wesleyan to his time as a lawyer.
John wrote constantly, describing the natural beauty of Minnesota, the potential of the young territory, and the importance of establishing it as an anti-slavery state.
Right. He sent his letters to a vast array of friends, acquaintances, organizations, and societies out east. Anne copied out his letters, compiling her own thoughts in addition to his, and sending them to her own contacts. Every day, they waited for their abolitionist friends to arrive in St. Anthony.
According to Stonehouse, the biographer, North attracted at least 1,000 people to St. Anthony in less than a year. That would mean John and Anne North single-handedly doubled the population of St. Anthony, almost every one of the newcomers sharing their belief in social reform.
Barely a year after arriving in St. Anthony, North was elected to the territorial legislature with a 2/3 majority, all thanks to his ingenious idea.
His plan to turn St. Anthony into an abolitionist haven was working, and it infuriated the most powerful men in Minnesota.
Franklin Steele, the wealthy sawmill operator, was particularly incensed at the Democratic Party's loss in his own hometown. In a letter, John North wrote,
Mr. Steele declared himself my eternal enemy. Mr. Steele gave out the word that my nomination must be broken down if possible.
North had already made powerful enemies, only a year after trekking to Minnesota.
In the meantime, Anne was managing her life in their little cabin. Wherever the Norths went, first would come John's books and Anne's piano. Anne sought to fulfill her vision of happiness in whatever way she could, though she felt her share of tragedies.
In 1850, 20-year-old Anne gave birth to and lost her first child. Her parents and grandmother briefly visited her but left for New York. John spent much of his time at the legislature. Anne was often alone.
Around this time, Anne wrote to her brother George, candidly reflecting on her deep internal struggle.
I find it difficult to act my part as a woman, to perform well all the duties that devolve upon me as such. I grow to feel my own nothingness more and more. In short, I am only a little child, and fear at times that in spite of my earnest endeavors to the contrary, I shall always remain so.
Anne loved her family deeply. According to Minnesota historian Annette Atkins, Anne asked her family to come see her in almost every letter from this period. The love was reciprocated. Her brothers would eventually follow her to Minnesota, building their own families alongside the Norths.
There was hope for her and her family. At times, her home in St. Anthony was the hub of activity in the small town. Anne wrote to a relative that with the increased outdoor work and clean air, John looked, quote, 50% better, end quote.
Perhaps invigorated by his newfound health, John made a mark with his brief time in the legislature. In his vision of society, few things were as important as an educated populace. Good schools were fundamental to creating a good state.
John North wrote the charter for what would become the University of Minnesota, putting his belief in the importance of education into practice. With a position as its first treasurer under his belt as well, he continued to become an important figure in Minnesota.
Like in New York, North would be pushed out of St. Anthony by a combination of forces. First, he failed to win re-election to the legislature in 1851 after being involved in a political kerfluffle regarding a census bill.
Second, he was bad with money. This will come up a lot. In the 3 years after leaving the legislature, North had a distinct pattern, asking his father-in-law, George Loomis, for money, falling into debt, finding a new opportunity for investment, asking his father-in-law for money, falling into debt. Without the support of Anne's family, North would have had nothing.
His law practice was not enough to cover his faulty financial decisions. North steadily began looking for other ways to stay afloat, namely, real estate.
Real estate. In January of 1855, John led a party of settlers south from the cities to investigate a growing tide of settlement in a place called the Cannon River Valley.
North was astonished by the natural beauty of the Cannon River Valley. In a letter to his father-in-law, John said,
The whole valley of this river is beautiful and very fertile. The crabapple and wild plum grow there in great abundance and furnish fruit to the settlers. There are fortunes in these new towns, especially those that will be county seats. I am trying to get out of my profession, and if I can do so, mean to live by outdoor business.
North just needed to find the right spot to establish himself in the area.
There was a clear choice. A trading village led by a man named Alexander Faribault was situated on the confluence of the Strait and Cannon rivers and had been an important economic junction for decades. John North arrived in the area just in time. The settlers of this town, itself named Faribault, were prepared to plat out the land officially. In preparation of the official platting, North purchased 1/4 of the land in Faribault.
When Faribault was platted out in 1855, the four most important men who met together to plan out land ownership and consider the future of the town were John North, Alexander Faribault, Henry Sibley, and an Irish immigrant and veteran named James Shields. North would maintain a business and political relationship with Henry Sibley for several years and with General Shields as well, but not with Alexander Faribault.
In fact, outside of this initial meeting, there's little recorded evidence of interaction between Alex and John North. Although John and Anne considered moving to Faribault.
Faribault, little south. There you go.
Yep, and then a swoop. John soon sold his $1,000 worth of land. The cause of John's decision to start his own town instead of joining Faribault can only be speculated.
After selling his Faribault land, North invested more than $4,000 into the creation of a new mill along the Cannon River and a spot north of Faribault.
But he didn't actually go there.
Oh.
So we'll just scribble that out. I don't have an eraser.
On one side of the river was an outstretched prairie. On the other, the big woods promised plenty of timber. Increasingly excited about the prospects of this new land, John committed to building up the young settlement, Anne referred to simply as John's Cannon River hobby in her letters.
Mother asks me why I desire to go to Cannon River to live. You know, to a woman like me, the place of one's residence matters little, so she can be with her own family and have the conveniences of a home. Mr. North is obliged to spend more than half his time there, and that of itself is sufficient reason for me to want to go there to live.
There were about a dozen families surrounding North's mill, primarily humble farmers and German immigrants. As the mill neared its completion in the fall, North and some of the other families came together to officially plat out this community and give it a name. In October of 1855, the small farming community, for the first time, called itself Northfield.
I'll get rid of some of the scribbles and fix it with a Northfield. Woo!
Anne, now mother to 3 children, followed John to Northfield on January 3rd, 1856. Life was, to put it simply, not easy for her. In a letter to a relative from February of 1856, Anne described her health and her children's health.
I am now enjoying my 22nd boil on my side. One has just got well. I suffer considerably from the soreness in my side and chest. Johnny's gums are badly swollen. Georgie got a sore throat coming down here. Clara has one large boil on her neck. Emma was never in better health and spirits.
At least Emma was doing fine.
The tremendous amount of work Anne survived is mind-boggling. The physical work of keeping children healthy and safe in the 1850s, the emotional work of combating loneliness in a small settlement with John often gone, the mental work of remembering responsibilities, balancing worries, and writing letters constantly. Amidst it all, Anne fought to build her own vision of a family in Northfield.
Among that family was her beloved brother, George, who lived with the Norths in Northfield. George, a responsible, intelligent man, would become one of John's greatest friends and supporters. George warned John constantly about his terrible financial decisions with limited success. The two respected and grew to love each other, though.
The town of Northfield began to grow in accordance with John's vision. The radical people he attracted to St. Anthony, he attracted to Northfield. A post office was established, followed shortly by a schoolhouse. Alongside mill workers and merchants, preachers and school teachers, a new kind of community was forming. The intellectual crown jewel, however, was the Lyceum Debating Society.
Housed in a modest structure that is today Northfield's oldest wooden building, the Lyceum Society was the intellectual center of North's utopian vision. The cultured thinkers of the city held debates here about slavery, women's rights, and about dancing. Choirs sang abolitionist hymns. Northfield's first library was created and furnished there.
In 1856, with this community forming largely the way he had envisioned it, John North was ecstatic.
No portion of the country, east or west, can boast a more intelligent or enterprising people than the scattering inhabitants of this valley.
Emily Willie Skinner once described John North as, quote, well fitted to create and mold public sentiment, end quote. John's daughter, reflecting on his time in Northfield, commented, quote, his untiring devotion to the public good, his great charity, his humor, his genial sociability, and above all, his unwavering integrity cannot have failed to leave their mark, end quote. As his young town developed, John saw his dreams start to come together. The mills started pulling in more profits than expenses. North's reputation buoyed by the growth of his town. He was well equipped to again attempt to make his mark on Minnesota territory.
While building his town, North and several of his friends had founded the Republican Party of the state of Minnesota as well, officially calling for the end of slavery. That was the state of things for John North when Congress passed an enabling act, calling for Minnesota's admission into the Union. Delegates would be needed to frame the state constitution.
This was John's chance. As with his time in St. Anthony, North must have felt compelled to fight for an explicit anti-slavery voice in the state constitution. And as one of the founders of the state's Republican Party, he was now a leader in that fight. 42-year-old John Wesley North was elected as a delegate to the Constitutional Convention in 1857.
The convention was a total mess from beginning to end. As described by biographer Stonehouse, quote, the enabling act passed by Congress did not specify the hour at which the convention was to meet on the designated Monday, saying merely that it would meet at the usual hour. And no agreement could be made between the Republican and Democratic caucuses as to what the usual hour was, end quote.
The Republicans, led by John North, arrived early to ensure that a Republican was president of the convention. Before the Democrats realized what was going on, John North was in the front of the room calling for a vote. Someone loudly nominated North as president. As the Democrats rushed into the room, the Republicans voted to approve North. A furor erupted, and eventually the Republicans stormed out of the room.
From that point on, Minnesota had two separate constitutional conventions occurring at the same time. One Democrat, one Republican. The two conventions met in rooms on opposite sides of the building. The intense, bitter anger between the parties was a precursor to the violence of the Civil War, only 4 years away.
Some members of the conventions recognized the absurdity of the situation and attempted to bring the two parties together. John North was not one of them. In several situations, North advocated for causes that threatened the party's unity and potentially even the admission of the state into the Union.
For centuries, any property owned by a married woman was legally not hers, but her husband's. And this was true in Minnesota Territory as well. Under the common law of Minnesota Territory, a married woman could not sign her own contracts or own or sell any property of her own. On July 28th, John North proposed an amendment guaranteeing property and contract rights to married women.
According to Charles Seacombe, when North entered the idea for discussion, many in the convention believed he was, quote, offering it as a joke, end quote. It became clear soon, however, that John was serious.
Delegate Thomas Wilson, a 30-year-old Irish immigrant and lawyer from Winona, was indignant.
We ought not in our constitution to legislate upon any subject, and certainly not upon this. As soon as ye place women in that sphere, ye deprive her of all true womanhood. Our next step would be to the ballot box. If we go to this extent, we may justly be called women's rights men. I protest against saying directly or indirectly that a Minnesota legislature needs to be bound to do justice to women as such.
John North's response was sarcastic and direct.
It is a little amusing to see how people are terrified for fear there may be a little item of fanaticism worked into the Constitution we are framing. It is amusing to see them frightened when they are so far from danger, and to see them work themselves up into a fever heat, for fear the world is going to make some great revolution and turn things topsy-turvy which have stood upright for so many years, and that our opponents will call us fanatics. I confess I have no such fear. I think it is nonsense to be frightened for fear we shall make some improvement, and for fear the old fogies of the present day will call it fanaticism. I want to know if married women ought not to have some rights. if they ought to be completely under the control of their husbands in all aspects and under all circumstances. This seems to me to be one of the most wise, just, and wholesome provisions we can incorporate into our Constitution, and one which should be made as prominent in the fundamental law as any other.
The amendment was approved, 32 in the affirmative and 19 opposing. As the convention continued, delegates worked strenuously to create a compromise constitution. As progress was being made, however, the Democrats were startled by claims that the Republicans would do something horrible: extend the right to vote to non-whites.
Indeed, a small number of Republicans fought to include non-white suffrage in the Minnesota Constitution. The leader of this radical group, John North. On August 6th, North made a detailed, eloquent speech in which he called for his fellow delegates to strike out the word white as a requirement for access to the ballot box.
It is wrong to insert that word here. I look upon it as an absolute wrong, which we as a convention have no right to inflict upon any class of our fellow men. The contour of the countenance, the complexion of the face which the Creator has stamped on human beings, does not give one class the right to inflict wrong and injury upon another. It does not give us the right to say that we have rights which are natural and inalienable, and to say to another class, you are deprived of those rights. Shall we turn coldly away from the demand of justice and humanity, and from appeals which come to us as strongly as appeals can come to the human mind and heart, and lay aside all considerations of justice and compassion, and sneakingly oppress those who've been denied simple justice for more than 80 years that we have existed as a nation?
North's insistence on including non-white men under the umbrella of suffrage was a step too far for his Republican colleagues. To them, the risk was too high that Democrats would refuse to work on any constitution that included voting rights for black men. In such a case, it would be possible for Minnesota's admission to the Union to be delayed.
According to a St. Paul paper, North's insistence on black suffrage was, quote, the rock the committees split upon, end quote.
Few people outside of North were willing to chance statehood on the question of non-white suffrage.
So the Republicans turned down North's proposal, 34-16. Black men living in Minnesota were denied voting rights.
North's fiery defense of voting rights caught the attention of newspapers statewide, however, and the foundation was laid for the change that would come after the Civil War. In 1865, the population of Minnesota approved a state amendment extending suffrage to black men. At that time, Governor William Marshall reportedly said, quote, "We are indebted to J.W. North more than to any other man for this victory," end quote.
Back in 1857, the Democratic and Republican conventions each appointed a compromise committee to iron out the details of the final Constitution.
The Compromise Committee almost fell apart when Territorial Governor Willis Gorman attacked Thomas Wilson with a cane, but somehow they continued to meet. The Republicans reported back to their convention, the Democrats to theirs. The parties refused to sign the same document, however, so Minnesota had two separate constitutions to send to Congress.
That territorial governor with the cane went on to lead the first Minnesota in the first Battle of Bull Run, putting his political violence to use. Back to the Constitution. Although there were more than 300 spelling, punctuation, and grammar differences between the two constitutions, the meaning was generally the same, and this standard was good enough. When the Constitution was approved by Congress and by the people of Minnesota in 1858, John North returned to Northfield, having continued to make some enemies, but also having proven himself as a leader.
In the meantime, Anne's family in Northfield had grown. John's strong-willed sister Clara was living with them. Anne's brother George married Kate Ashley in 1856, both of them living in Northfield. Her youngest brother Charlie lived with George. For a time, Anne could count on the comfort and joy of seeing her brothers daily and spending time with them. She even planned on constructing a room in her own home for Charlie.
In 1858, George's family dog contracted rabies and attacked Charlie. He survived the initial attack, but was left paralyzed by the virus.
As Charlie succumbed to rabies, Anne was frozen. She denied to herself the severity of his illness, mentioning none of it to her parents in any letters. She couldn't bring herself to let on to her parents about what she had done by asking Charlie to come to Minnesota.
After several months of suffering under the debilitating effects of rabies, Charlie died. He was 25.
Anne came clean to her parents, who rushed to Minnesota to mourn their son. The grief and the guilt haunted Anne. George was her only sibling now.
At the same time, a devastating economic panic was sending shockwaves throughout the infant state, disrupting families and stunting the state's growth. Among those caught in the disaster was John North.
With many Minnesotan bigwigs, including his old rival Franklin Steele, as well as Governor Sibley and Senator James Shields, North had become director of an ambitious project called the Minneapolis and Cedar Valley Railroad.
Not only was the company thrown into disarray, but North made an exceptionally inept director. By every account, when faced with the opportunity to yield profit at the expense of the public, North would unerringly side with the public.
This made him a terrible railroad director. He was bad with money, and often this was as much a result of his disregard for self-interest as it was anything else.
In 1859, North was confronted by the rest of the board of directors. He was bedridden by yet another illness, so he met them at his home. After a series of disagreements, his entire board of directors resigned in his home, and the feisty James Shields challenged him to a duel.
North disregarded the challenge and agreed to relinquish his control of the company to Shields. But he couldn't give up his investment in the company. He owed the company more than $30,000. In order to pay all his dues, he would need to mortgage or sell everything he owned.
In an attempt to finally separate North from the company, Franklin Steele offered to buy $50,000 worth of land near Northfield so North could pay off his debts. John refused. He held on to his railroad bonds for 25 years. The railroad eventually became the Milwaukee Road, a vital rail in the Midwest for most of the 20th century. Much of it still exists today under the operation of the Canadian Pacific Railway.
North's failure as a railroad director stained his reputation and devastated his finances. His abolitionist friend Charles Wheaton had to buy out the mill to save it from collapse. By 1860, North was barely eking by. Everything was slipping from his control.
Then he met Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln, only recently nominated by the Republican Party as a candidate for the presidency, was not North's first choice. He'd read newspaper reports that Lincoln planned to kick radicals out of the Republican Party.
North introduced himself to the nominee in Springfield and had a few words to say to him.
I told him that if the statement in the papers was correct, that he was going to throw the radicals overboard, that I wanted him to understand that I was a radical.
Lincoln invited North to join him in traveling to Chicago. Over their travel together, North became a great admirer of Lincoln and committed to campaigning for him. A friendly acquaintance had been struck between the two men.
Lincoln's election in 1860 signaled a potential escape from financial despair for North. If he could secure a position in the administration, he would find steady employment and the opportunity to effect deep change. His dream was to become superintendent of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, a department that was notoriously corrupt and had consistently backstabbed American Indians.
North spent several months in Washington, D.C. lobbying for a position with the administration. Winter is on its way. North desperately needs something. If he returned home empty-handed, he was unsure how he would keep his family afloat. He would be forced to take whatever he could get.
North received news from the president. He had been appointed Surveyor General of Nevada Territory.
So that's just kind of a blob. Sure.
That's probably Nevada.
Yeah, somewhere.
There he goes.
Good.
He had to pack up and cross the country, leaving behind Minnesota and Northfield.
In 1861, 6 years after founding the town, John and Ann North left Northfield.
The rest of John North's life was as unpredictable and unstable as his time in Minnesota. After writing the first draft of Nevada's state constitution and serving as president at its constitutional convention, he was appointed as a justice on the state Supreme Court. He was pushed out of Nevada by financial ruin and ill health. Once again, John and their 6 children, Ann's brother George and his wife, packed up and headed off in search of John's new dream.
After courting financial security briefly in California.
California for a little bit.
That's easy.
kind of a, that's...
The entire West Coast.
Yeah, so he just goes there.
Sorry, Oregon and Washington. The old flame reappeared in John's soul, an egalitarian utopian community. It was 1866, and with the end of the Civil War, slavery had been abolished. But in the devastated South, a battle was raging for the soul of peace.
North liquidated all of his assets and invested everything he had in Knoxville, Tennessee.
Could be anywhere from here to here.
Yeah,
So,
this isn't to scale.
yeah, right there. Look at that. Whee!
It'd be cool if this turned into some sort of shape.
Yeah, that
But
would be cool.
It isn't.
His plan? To create a community of black and white citizens living together with equal rights and equal protection under the law.
Reportedly, after John North stopped a crowd from lynching a black man, his business in town was boycotted by the community. He lost everything. Again, his dream for a racially integrated colony in the post-war South was crushed.
But his dream of creating the ideal community persisted. He uprooted everything once more in 1870, now 55 years old. The North struck out for California, where he founded another town, Riverside.
Riverside, California. That's Southern California, like LA. LA is
Sure.
there. There he goes.
A colony, quote, dedicated to furthering education and culture, end quote. Riverside boomed, becoming a wealthy, successful citrus town.
Within a decade, North was moving again, managing an irrigation colony near Fresno, California.
Fresno.
Fresno.
Actually, Fresno's kind of here. About. So up here.
He sold the land for a pretty penny. Despite the financial troubles that dogged him throughout his life, he had finally achieved a degree of success.
Now 70 years old, John invested everything he had in the creation of a final town, Oleander.
And Oleander's, like, it's pretty much right there. That's where it is.
Great.
Anne was more than 50 years old. Faced with another of John's plans to create a perfect community, Anne paused. John's daughter Emma once recollected, quote, "Since my earliest remembrance, I had been accustomed to my father's comings and goings," end quote. John was going, but this time, Anne stayed behind.
Anne called Oleander a wild goose chase. She stayed in San Francisco, living with her brother George, who was now the president of the South Pacific Oil Company. Anne moved her family 8 times in the pursuit of John's dream, seen 6 children go into adults, suffered during the many long periods living without him, and through it, she stuck with him. After Charlie's horrid death, she couldn't stand being separated from her family, and so she made her choice.
John operated a small farm in Oleander, situated in the middle of seemingly uninhabitable desert. He was certain, however, that he could turn it into a paradise.
Unlike his time in St. Anthony, Northfield, or Riverside, John was not followed by a crowd of like-minded supporters. Striving furiously but feebly to build Oleander to the city of his dreams, he lived mostly by himself, passing the time by writing love letters to Anne and advertisements of Oleander to his friends.
Red ants overran his home as he built up his desert farm with money borrowed from his son. At night, swarms of flies would put out his candles. With no bustling community to support him, he descended into poverty in Oleander, his toxic final dream.
John Wesley North was 75 when he died on February 22nd, 1890. He asked to be cremated without any ceremonies and to have his ashes spread on the plains near Los Angeles, between the mountains and the sea. Never being one to really get what he wants, he was instead buried at Riverside's Evergreen Cemetery, where he remains today. All his possessions went to Anne, including his books and a home in Oleander, and $3,000 in debt. 14 years after he was buried, Anne joined him for the final time, laid next to John in the Evergreen Cemetery.
Seven years before his death, the aged John North was invited back to Minnesota to reminisce with his old friends from the St. Anthony and Northfield days. Before leaving Oleander for the trip to speak with the millionaires who founded St. Anthony with him, John North needed to borrow a suit. Then he headed out.
On September 13th of 1883, John wrote a letter to Anne describing his time in Minnesota. As he sat in the town he founded 28 years earlier, Northfield. John North himself had repeatedly imploded in his quest for social reform. He could be reckless, bullheaded, but he was reckless in his pursuit of justice. Bullheaded in his fight for the betterment of society. Did John see his values reflected in the growing town he visited in 1883? We don't know. Before long, he was on the move again, heading back to California. And the final generation of Northfielders to meet John North carried on with building their community.